Hey everybody, today we're going to do something a little controversial. We're going to talk about the value of the original S4 and S6. And this is actually something I did last year. I filmed a video on this last year, but I never actually published it. I kind of got lost in the cracks, got busy, and honestly the equipment I used to create these videos was not the best, and we've basically just rectified that situation. So I have the ability to pump out videos a lot quicker and way more efficiently. So you'll be seeing more and more content, especially now that spring has finally arrived here in Minneapolis. I'll be in the garage more often. We'll be doing more projects and things. So definitely stay tuned for that. But like I said, today we're going to talk about values. And this is kind of an interesting one because if you're part of the online community, you'll know that there's a very small proponent of people that think they're worth a ton of money, and there's a lot of people that think that these cars are just worthless and that everything is overpriced. And I will say that most of the community are a bunch of, honestly, we're kind of cheap asses. This whole community has changed so much from the time that when I first got into these cars. First one I ever drove was actually in 1994, and it was a 93 model. It happened to be tornado red on black, and it was at the Audi dealer in Minneapolis. Was up looking at cars with my father, and we took it on a test drive, and loved the car. We're amazed. It had great performance. It was really comfortable. And back then, you got to think, when these cars were new, they typically had an MSRP. I mean, the sticker were in the neighborhood of $47,000. And the entire first year allocation was sold out very quickly because there was very few cars. I'll probably stick the number on the screen here if I can remember that, or at least the numbers I got from Audi when I was chasing down the production numbers. And the same basically held true for 93, 94. I mean, these cars didn't really sit around much. I mean, 95, there were, more of them. And so some of those you could actually find on lots, but they still weren't super common. And in fact, in 95, we got our very first S4 in July of 95. And that was after probably six to 8 months of looking. And we lived 2 hours south of the Minneapolis area. So we were predominantly dealing with the dealers in Minneapolis because the dealers in Iowa, where we lived, in Des Moines and Iowa City, they hardly ever got these cars. Des Moines, certainly, I don't know if I've ever seen one there. Iowa City would occasionally get one, but few and far between. Minneapolis, that was definitely a hot spot. So we would, talk to our sales guy up there, and he said, hey, we just got an S4, and he'd call us on, say, a Tuesday. We're like, great, we'll come up and look at it, this weekend. Well, he would call us Thursday and say, oh, unfortunately it sold Wednesday, So that happened a number of times, and at that time we didn't really want a dark colored car. I mean, we would love a red one, but you never really saw them. And the red on black 93s, as it turns out, there were like 29 or 39 of them. I'll put the number on the screen because it slips my mind right now, but that would explain why it was hard to find a red on black 93 for us. And we ended up with a pearl on ecru car, and the only way we got that was by putting a deposit on it sight unseen and then going up a day or two later and picking up that car. So it had changed a lot. And when I first started, S-CARS.org, I started, I believe it was May 8th of 98. So I have a birthday coming up here soon. And the ownership at that point were all first or second owners. And they tended to be, pretty well-heeled individuals. So they could spend money on upgrades, or they would certainly maintain their cars to a very high level. And so as a result, these cars, around that time I was also working with Car of Minnesota, and that was one of Kent's passions. He loved the Quattros, kind of the weirder Audis, the 91 200s and the Avants, the 20 valve coupe Quattros, 20 valve sedans. And of course, the original S4s and S6s sold a lot of those. And so at that point, they still had pretty solid resale values. It wasn't until, I would say, early 2000s, I would say, around 2003, 2004, a very nicely sorted car would run you about $15,000. And that's, I know when we bought the car that I'm standing next to here, it came from California, from an S-CARS.org member out there. And it was probably, I think it was in that neighborhood of like 13 or 14. And then we bought a 94 S4 from the original owner in South Carolina, and it was also, 15-ish, somewhere there. And of course, they were still easier to find at that point. So fast forwarding, many years later now, and I think that these cars have largely followed the trajectory of the Porsche 928, which is another car that, if you know me, I've had a thing. I've always loved 928s. What can I say? They're weird, but the 928 was a car that was very expensive when new, wasn't cheap to maintain, which very similar to an S4. And they basically fell into, I hate to say it, but the wrong hands. And a lot of that has happened also with the S4. They get bought by, sorry to say, kids who have only interest in going fast. And so everything else goes by the wayside, and it's, we'll throw a giant turbo at it and it'll blow up and we'll part it out. And that's the very short and not so sweet version. But a ton of these cars, because they are expensive to bring back, especially if it's been neglected for a long time, if you can't do it yourself, if you're going to pay someone to do it, it doesn't really make a lot of fiscal sense unless you have an absolute passion for these things, because you'll be very upside down. If you put 40 grand into a restoration of a tired old car, you're gonna have a hard time reclaiming that. So I would say in today's market, you see this spectrum of cars. I would say on the low end, you've got the $2,000 to $3,000 more or less parts cars. Yes, they may run and drive, but they are typically so needy that it becomes a bit of a lost cause to try to restore them. And I think at that level, you're talking about, these are parts cars, or these are the cars that get used and abused, like winter beaters, and they get driven for a couple seasons and then something bad happens and the car is just done forever. And above that, where you get into the, okay, now you can actually drive it and it's a viable car to maybe start with, you're probably in that $6,000 to $8,000 range. And that's the majority of the cars that I see for sale would probably fall into that, category where you can tell it's not lived maybe the best life, and it's had some perhaps well-meaning prior owners or current owner that may be selling it might have put a lot of time and effort into trying to bring it back as best as he or she could. But there's just a point where they realize maybe this is a lost cause for them. And honestly, the reason the values of these cars are so low, one, it's the community. We have extremely low self-esteem from what I've seen. If you pay any attention to the BMW or Mercedes-Benz or any of the other contemporaries of this car, I mean, even the Caprice Classic community puts more value into their period cars. I mean, go look at one of those right now. Just look it up and see what some of those sell for. I don't know why anyone would want to drive a Glacier, but I certainly wouldn't spend that kind of money for one. And yet this car, the original S4 and S6, we're talking, in the United States at least, this is really the genesis of the S-Series cars. I would argue that, yes, the 200, 20 valves were probably the successor, but they didn't officially get the S badge. And so this was the very first S badge car for the United States, or for North America. And I realize, in Europe, the S2 predates this, but it was, it's an important car when you think about the history of Audi. And unfortunately, that brings me to my second point, which is Audi itself. The other manufacturers like Mercedes-Benz, Porsche, even BMW have more pride in their history. And I won't say Audi doesn't have pride in their history, but I mean, they love to utilize it for marketing. Like you'll see the Sport Quattros, you'll see, one of these cars maybe in an old ad or something. But in terms of actually supporting the vintage community, like the other marks do, I've actually kind of worked at one point as a service manager, and I was pretty shocked to see, Mercedes and Porsche in particular, how many parts are still available for their vintage cars. And with Audi, it is, I would say, the worst of any of the German brands, at least here in America. Audi Tradition, the website is, obviously you can't order from that website here in the States. There are some dealers that may jump through the hoops and allow you to do that, but most of them don't want to be bothered with it, quite frankly. So you need to then find a connection in Germany that may ship you some of those. And I do have such a friend. Thank you, Dean. But otherwise, you're going to have a little bit of a challenge finding parts for these. And that ultimately scares a lot of people away from owning one, because they think, well, that's a cool car, but if it breaks, I'm toast, like I can't get parts for that. And that becomes kind of the elephant in the room with a lot of these in terms of value, is people are just afraid of owning something that might just become a paperweight. So, and we'll have some future videos on addressing that and, taking some of the fear out of that, quite frankly. But in the meantime, I do think these cars, honestly, are undervalued. I would argue that all day long. I mean, now I will put a little caveat with that. Not all of these cars are undervalued. A lot of these cars are used, abused, and in need of dire help. And so cars of that level, it's still going to be a tough proposition. But I mean, if you have a really nice one that you get a really solid starting point, then absolutely it's worth the enjoyment of owning one. And like I said, you're going to have to spend, if you want a nice car, I still think 10 grand. I mean, you're going to be in that $10,000 to $14,000 range to get a very nice car. And I would probably say that the car that I'm standing on here, I'm next to my Pearl 93, which you've also seen on this channel. If I were to sell this at this point, I would probably be in that, I don't know, 10 to 12 grand asking price. And, interior wise, really clean, really nice. I mean, I've obviously kept up with this car and maintenance and the conditioning of the leather, so it doesn't suffer from as much of the maladies that some of the other cars will. That once they go through 6-7 owners, and you never know who's going to have it and who just leaves it parked out to get baked in the sun. Thank you, car. But then we should also address the Avant factor, and this is the part where I'm a little bit, I think the Avants are actually overpriced compared to the sedans, but yet not overpriced in a way. I think the Avant pricing is sort of what these cars should be worth. Like, to buy a really nice Avant, you're probably looking at 20 grand. Honestly, it's not that big of a stretch. To buy a decent driver Avant, you're probably in the 10 to 12. So yeah, typically I see Avant pricing in that anywhere 2 to 4 grand more than a sedan. Now, I don't think there's that, I've had an Avant, as you know. I don't think there's really that big of a jump in value in terms of the driving. I mean, it's great being able to haul stuff, but as you know, I had an Avant and I let it go in order to grab this 93. And the thing with the Avant, yes, it may be a little more balanced because it's got all that extra weight in the rear. So you're not quite as front heavy as the sedans, but it's also heavier, and I could definitely feel that heft, daily driving that thing. The acceleration, you feel it, they're really cool. I would love a red Avant. But at the same time, if you have your heart set on an Avant and you can't find one, I mean, if you really have to have the wagon or the storage space, I get it. But otherwise, look at the sedans. Find a really nice sedan, honestly. Like, the driving, the feel is not that different. Yeah, I think between the sedan and the Avant, you definitely have a price variance there. And obviously that is somewhat rarity influenced as well. There just aren't that many Avants and not that many nice ones available that, if you go shopping for one, you'll find out really quickly there's just not that many to be found. So the other thing I would bring into this is, I know there's a few of you that realize this, unfortunately, but from my role, I was the original webmaster for the Audi Club back in the day, and then I started S-CARS.org officially in '98. Prior to that, I actually, my first website was what I believe was the first Audi owner registry online, which I created in the fall of '95. And it got to be so kind of big, and I was, hand coding all that stuff back then. And so that one I kind of slimmed down. We sort of retired that a little bit, and then I chose to focus on the S models, which is how S-Cars came about. But along with those two associations and some other clients that I had dealt with over the years, I have always tracked the value of these cars, and I've tried to keep track of sale data. And just those of you that may have emailed me about, hey, I bought this car, and I'll ask you about the history, and it turns out I know the prior owner. And that's happened for quite a few cars over the years. Like, oh yeah, I know that car, or I even drove that car when it was at Car of Minnesota years ago. So since then, though, I would say probably starting in 90, I'm trying to think, the first one I did was probably in the year 2000, maybe 99 or 2000. I got involved with helping people that have unfortunately totaled their cars and were dealing with insurance companies on total loss scenarios. And so what typically happens when that unfortunate event happens is the insurance companies, given the low production and sales of these, there's not a lot of data that they have access to easily, and they tend to then throw comparable 100s or A6s into the mix, which of course is not a good thing for for you as an S-Car owner trying to get a legitimate value payout on your total loss. So I would oftentimes work with a prior owner and say, okay, give me your survey, and I need to learn about your car as best I can. Give me photos as recent as possible so I can see the overall condition, inside, outside, etc. Do you have service records you can show me? So I kind of do the research into the car and say, okay, well that's a really nice car, for example, and something like that would likely be worth this amount of money. And then I will have that kind of number in mind, but then I also keep track of sales and listings of these cars so I can kind of follow the market trend, and I use that data and will provide that data to the insurance companies, and all this, with VINs, etc. Like it's all documented. And as a result, we've successfully gotten owners out of some pretty dire scenarios in terms of insurance companies wanting to pay somebody, $2,500 for a car that was very clearly a $12,500 car, and actually the last one I did now for an original S car was, thankfully about a year ago, and again got a decent settlement value for that particular owner. But I also do the D2 S8s and have done a couple of those, including my own. I had to fight with Farmers Insurance on that. So that could be a whole nother discussion sometime if you want to go down that rabbit hole and hear about the interesting insurance settlement scenarios. And of course, they always want you to hire an expert appraiser, and I'm like, okay, who's your expert appraiser for these cars? Because I guarantee I will know them. If they know anything about these cars, I will know who they are. And there's a few people out there that I think would be valid experts in determining values on these, but it's a short list, and without really keeping track of it and trying to track the data, I don't think the insurance companies have a leg to stand on, quite honestly. And that's why I've come into the fold here, and I sort of enjoy fighting insurance companies. I'm not into, and I will say that I don't ever charge any of the owners for this, because if I look at your car and I say, hey, that's a $3,000 car, and you get all upset about that, wanting me to write it up as an $8,000 car, I just won't do that. There's just that doesn't benefit anybody. That's also fraud, and I'm not into insurance fraud. So I think having that sort of, and this is why I encourage you, if you have one of these cars, please, please, please talk to, and this is not a paid spot, but talk to like Grundy Insurance. That's who I prefer to use on mine, and get an agreed value policy for your car. And if you need help determining the value of that, what your car might be worth, then by all means reach out. I can certainly try to help you with that. Or a lot of times you can just say, hey, here's my car. They're going to want to see photos of your car, inside, outside, etc. A list of any modifications. They, oddly enough, they tend to prefer cars with modifications of some kind. I know a few people that have been denied with a stock original car, and that's partially because I don't think they're that well, or they weren't that aware of these cars. At least when I first listed mine, I believe I was the first person to ever list an S-car with Grundy, because they didn't show it in their database. They didn't say, hey, that's not a collectible car. They had no idea what it was. So I pretty much had to do this whole write-up about what the car was, why it's collectible, why it's actually worth having an agreed value policy, the rarity of, etc. And then they were like, well, okay, no problem. So that's another thing. Definitely do that if you want to protect your, I don't want to say investment, because I don't view these as investment cars, but definitely protect yourself that way. Because if you're insured with a company like, I'll just throw State Farm out there, and you have a total loss, you will have a total headache. And I'll just go on record as saying that in my 20 plus years of doing this, the number one insurance company that I hate to deal with is State Farm. They have far and away been the worst, time and time and time again. They drag things out. In fact, the last guy I helped was a big D2SA guy, Rich in Texas, and he had a hailstorm total his D2, and we started the conversation. I said, who's your insurance company? And he said, I have State Farm. And I'm like, oh. And I said, I don't mean to frighten you, but by the end of this, you're going to hate State Farm with a passion, and you will probably drop them. And he kind of laughed. He's like, no, my agent is great, and it'll be good. And he does not have State Farm anymore. And the thing is like, yes, a lot of their agents are fantastic. They're really friendly. They're good guys. No problem. But when you total a car, it goes beyond your agent's hands, and it gets handed off to, somebody. Like, I was dealing with farmers in my case, and they're in Oklahoma, so I'm dealing with the next tier up. And those guys, they never see you. They don't actually shake your hand or take your money. Their job is to not pay you, is to get out of this as cheap as they possibly can, because the money flow with insurance companies is a super sucker vortex inward, and like a little tiny little drink mixing straw outbound. So that's just the way they roll, and they will wait you out. They will throw every kind of roadblock at you to not pay you a fair value. And they'll say, oh, here's your comps, but the trouble is, I look through those, and you run the VINs, and like some of those are A6s. interesting. And Farmers was trying this with me as well, and we're going to the point where I just simply was not accepting their value. Like, they were telling me that my 2003 S8 was worth something like $5,000, and like, there's no way. This thing is, you know, really nice, really well maintained, and I had comparable S8 sales and values. And the really fun part with them was we kept fighting, and they said, okay, you need to hire an appraiser, and they pulled that on me. And I said, okay, do me a favor, because I just realized that I had settled an S-CAR claim in Chicago the prior year. And I said, look up this claim number in your system, it was in Chicago, and look at the expert appraiser for that settlement. And I kid you not, they responded the very next morning, oh, Mr. Niederhoff, we're happy to tell you that we've looked at some new valuation models, and your car is now worth exactly what I asked for on day one. Exactly, to the dot, they just folded and said, okay. And I think it drives me insane that you have to go to that extent with these companies, but it is what it is, and you have to be super persistent. So anyhow, this has gone way off the rails, but that is a big caveat for you. Get proper insurance. Don't trust the big name. I mean, if you're just doing liability because you've got an old beater, then it really doesn't matter. But if you have a really nice car, definitely do yourself a favor and get agreed value insurance. Grundy has, I will say, I priced both Hagerty and Grundy here in the US. Hagerty was twice the price and had a lot more restrictive use limitations. Grundy, once I got them to agree to insure me, they've been fantastic to deal with. And actually, I only ever had one claim, and that was the windshield on the red car. And that wound up, it was absolutely painless. They were great to deal with, no problem. The issue I had was with the glass installer, was effectively committed insurance fraud doing that, which frankly pisses me off, but that's another story for another day. So thank you for watching. I know we went off on a tangent here quite a bit, but just to recap, a beater S4, you're probably in the anywhere from $1,500 for the parts car to, I would say, if it runs and drives, $2,500 to $4,500. To get a decent one, anywhere in that 6 to 8, and then anything nice is going to be probably 10 grand or more. Avance, add 2 to 4 grand. Really nice Avance, you're going to spend 20 grand. Easy as that. You're going to spend that or more. So know it going in there. And definitely, I do think they're undervalued. It's a sleeping car right now. There's a lot of people that, if you watch the other big YouTube channels, very few people are looking at these or driving these just because you don't find them. It's not like, the BMW community. You can find those old M5s. Everybody put them on pedestals, it seems like, and rubbed them with diapers. And that's a talk of overvalue to me. But yeah, anyhow, thanks for watching. And we'll go off on a tangent again next time. Take care.